The status of Taiwan is one of the most critical issues of our time. President of the People's Republic of China Xi Jinping has repeatedly promised to reunify the island with the mainland under the rule of the Communist Party. Despite pleas from the Republic of China, as Taiwan is officially known, Communist Party leadership have repeatedly refused to rule out the use of force. As China's military capabilities grow, so too does the anticipation of an attack across the Taiwan Straits. In 2021, the outgoing head of the US Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, warned that conflict could occur by 2027. Regardless of how accurate Davidson's stark warning may be, it is helpful to examine the colourful but turbulent history of Taiwan and its relationship with mainland China, to truly understand the context of the present crisis. Despite its proximity to the mainland, Taiwan is not simply a Chinese island, but has a rich, intricate history and culture of its own. Isolated by the formidable waters of the strait, shielded by treacherous reefs and guarded by steep cliffs along much of its coastline, the very nature of the island was hostile to outsiders. People have lived continuously on this foreboding isle since at least 3000 BC. The indigenous population springs from the ancient Austronesians, while the bulk of the modern population are descended from a unique mix of immigration and settlement from southern China over the course of hundreds of years. Taiwan and the mainland maintained a checkered relationship. While local trading between the two coasts was prevalent, shipwrecked sailors could often meet a gruesome fate at the hands of Aboriginal tribes. The first major conflict between the peoples on the island and the mainland occurred in around 600 AD, when the Sui dynasty launched a series of expeditions to Taiwan to force the reclusive and often violent local tribes to pay tribute. They were unsuccessful and departed, though left a trail of destruction in their wake. By the 1300s, a trickle of mainland Chinese were settling in the Penghu Islands in the Taiwan Strait, and by the 1500s the island was a hub for fishing, smuggling and piracy under the nose of the Ming dynasty on the mainland. The Ming emperors did not regard Taiwan as part of China. It was around this time that Portuguese sailors found the island, christening it Ilha Formosa, the beautiful island. European settlers were not far behind. The Dutch East India Company established a trading outpost on Taiwan in 1622, and the Spanish also had a smaller, short-lived presence. The need for manpower to cultivate the growing Dutch colony prompted far greater Chinese migration, though this was a fickle relationship as colonists engaged in vicious fighting with indigenous tribes and later uprisings by the immigrant Chinese. After 1644, the fate of Taiwan would be irreversibly entwined with the mainland as Beijing fell to the new Qing dynasty. Undeterred by the changing winds of history, a dwindling number of Ming loyalists continued to fight. Foremost among these was Koxinga. Koxinga's last counter-offensive to retake Beijing failed. Determined to win the civil war in what he envisaged as a generational struggle, Koxinga retreated across the strait and established a final redoubt on Taiwan. Koxinga and his army were greeted as liberators by Chinese settlers. Aided by some local tribes, he besieged and defeated the 900-strong Dutch garrison, an act now mythologized in Taiwanese folklore. Like many great men of history, Koxinga's descendants did not live up to his legacy, and, facing an invasion from the mainland in 1683, surrendered to the Qing dynasty. The new Kangxi emperor was hesitant to retain Taiwan, disparaging it as merely a ball of mud beyond the sea. But one of his advisors changed his mind. I have personally travelled through Taiwan and seen firsthand the fertility of its wild lands and the abundance of its natural resources. This is truly a bountifully fertile piece of land and a strategic territory. For the first time, Taiwan was controlled by the mainland. The island was never entirely peaceful, and revolts and uprisings were commonplace. One governor famously claimed, "Every 3 years an uprising, every 5 a rebellion." A steady stream of migration continued from southern China. Rather than divide and conquer, Qing rulers made a notable effort to reduce conflict between the newly settled Chinese and Aborigines, even as Han Chinese immigration increased through the 1700s. Taiwan would bear witness to the slow, painful demise of the Qing dynasty through its century of humiliation until 1895, when, as part of the settlement following China's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, the island was surrendered to Japan. Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time, had briefly attempted to resist its surrender. the local government proclaimed independence as the breakaway yet distinctly Chinese Republic of Formosa. This charade collapsed with the arrival of the first Japanese troops. Formosa was an important addition to the Japanese Empire, not only crucial economically due to its fertile arable land and natural resource wealth, but it also provided Japan a solid strategically important base from which it could project power into the Pacific. Initially, the Japanese rulers viewed the local population with a degree of disdain, and the Taiwanese, both indigenous and immigrant, fought the Japanese occupation in a long-running insurgency, which inflicted considerable casualties on the Imperial Japanese Army. Nevertheless, the colony was prosperous and competently governed. Through the 1900s, Japan implemented a policy of assimilation, integrating more Taiwanese into colonial administration and creating local militias to help maintain security. By the 1930s, Taiwan was seen as a model colony. As the empire expanded and marched to war against China and later in the Second World War, Taiwanese men fought in the Japanese army, and the island itself acted as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which towards the end of the war the US Navy did its very best to sink. Before the Second World War, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang Party emerged as the rulers of China from the years of chaos following the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. Chiang did not harbour any particularly strong views regarding Taiwan. He believed it was a lost Chinese territory, similar to Korea, but never viewed it as an integral part of China. Nor was the island ever mentioned in China's various constitutions through the 1930s. By 1942, however, political groups agitating for Taiwan's return were folded into the Kuomintang Party, or KMT, and Taiwan's importance slowly filtered upwards. Chiang Kai-shek's invitation to the Cairo Conference in 1943 cemented China as one of the Big Four Allied powers. The conference between the United States, Britain and China focused on the conduct of the Pacific War. While President Roosevelt had a soft spot for China, the US was never particularly happy with the KMT's rule. American servicemen aiding the Chinese war effort against Japan grew increasingly frustrated by rampant corruption, poor productivity, and military ineptitude. Chiang Kai-shek repeatedly asked for US support, which rarely seemed to be put to any use, earning him the nickname "Cash My Check" among American policymakers. Nevertheless, the final declaration of the summit included the pledge that all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, such as Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Republic of China rapidly established control of Taiwan. Unlike their previous transfer of ownership, the Taiwanese people were generally excited at the prospect of Chinese rule. The 6 million islanders were soon to be disappointed. Taiwan's new rulers knew little about the island and its people. They were suspicious of Taiwan's role in Japan's war effort and felt that the population had been dangerously Japanicized by 50 years of occupation. In addition to Japanese cultural influence, Taiwan is ethnically different from mainland China. In 1945, as they do today, the various Aboriginal tribes made up only a small percentage of the population, the majority of islanders being Hoklo, descended from waves of Han migration during the Qing dynasty. Later, pre-1949 arrivals were the Hakka peoples. The Hoklo and Hakka have their own language, which is commonly referred to now as Taiwanese, and distinct cultural identities both from each other and the mainland. Complicating matters further, the island's common language was, at the time, Japanese. These issues were not anything the new governor, Chen Yi, was particularly sensitive to. Despite being educated in Japan and marrying a Japanese woman, he insisted that locals speak to him in Mandarin. He had run his previous charge, the province of Fujian, into the ground, with rampant corruption and inefficiency. He got to work filling the new administration with new mainlanders, replacing the Taiwanese integrated under Japanese rule. The Chinese army looted towns, evicted islanders from their homes en masse, and intimidated anyone who didn't comply. On the mainland, fighting between the Nationalists and Mao Zedong's Communist Party had broken out, diverting the attention of Chiang Kai-shek and much of the KMT from their new territory. Taiwan's economy and infrastructure crumbled, as the skilled Japanese tradesmen it depended on were deported. The Republic of China had brought its rampant corruption, brutal authoritarianism, and gross incompetence with it, and resentment steadily grew. This resentment boiled over on the 28th of February 1947, after police and customs officials pistol-whipped a 40-year-old woman and shot a bystander. Rioting erupted, and the nearby police station was burned down. Over the following days, the violence spiraled out of control. Army reinforcements from the mainland cracked down on the Taiwanese, with vicious reprisals and summary executions, branding the rioters communists. In fact, very few were communists. The most common cause was Taiwanese independence. Further cracking down on Taiwanese identity, the KMT outlawed the Japanese language in favour of Mandarin, and attempted to roll back Japanese cultural influence. The death toll is a source of controversy even today, but most estimates range between 3,000 and 10,000 killed. It is known today as the 228 incident, owing to it taking place on the 28th of February. The 228 incident became an extremely sensitive subject for the KMT, and it sealed all records relating to the crisis. The KMT was ultimately defeated by the Communist Red Party. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and what was left of the KMT and its sluggish, ill-disciplined and poorly led army fled across the straits to Taiwan. Reflecting on the greatest defeat of his life, Chiang Kai-shek accepted full responsibility for the loss of the mainland. Only South Korea moved their embassy to Taiwan. The rest, including the United States, were waiting for the dust to settle, mulling when to recognize the new communist government. Up to 5,000 refugees a day were arriving in Taiwan, totaling over 2 million mainlanders. The island and the KMT were on their own. At the behest of the United States, some changes had been made following the 228 incident, including involving more Taiwanese in the local administration. Nationalist China had declared martial law in 1948 before the defeat to the Communists, removing Chiang Kai-shek's term limit and the need for national elections. Chiang was granted authority to radically reform the KMT. Membership was reshuffled, and older members from the mainland were pushed out, taking some of the corruption and other ills with them. Hundreds of party offices were opened across Taiwan, allowing for more political participation by local people and rooting the party into Taiwanese life. By 1952, native Taiwanese constituted 57% of the party's membership, though mainlanders still dominated the higher ranks. The army was reformed and substantially professionalized. Economic reforms quickly brought sky-high inflation under control. Land reform improved productivity and agricultural output, with profits then being used to fund the industrialization of Taiwan's economy. Despite these improvements, not all was rosy. The media was closely controlled by the government. Taiwanese culture and languages were suppressed. Martial law was still in effect. The KMT's frantic obsession with communist infiltration sparked an era of political repression known as the White Terror, in which thousands accused of communist sympathies were threatened, imprisoned, and executed. While the Taiwanese people harboured the painful memory of the 228 incident, growing tensions with Mao's newly founded People's Republic of China and memories of the Civil War instilled a fear of communism, and people adjusted to life under the economically successful KMT. These two pillars, economic success and defence against communism, formed the foundation of the KMT's political legitimacy. Initially, the United States had little appetite to support Chiang Kai-shek. Some parts of the State Department even briefly contemplated trying to engineer his replacement. A final peace settlement with Japan was still being hammered out at this time, and since Taiwan had been a Japanese territory, its legal status was still in question. With the outbreak of the Korean War on the 25th of June 1950, the American 7th Fleet was ordered into the Taiwan Strait to prevent both Communist China attacking Taiwan and also to stop the Republic of China on Taiwan from attacking the mainland. President Truman, announcing the naval deployment, stated, "The determination of the future status of Formosa must await the restoration of the security in the Pacific, a peace settlement with Japan, or consideration by the United Nations." Vehemently objecting, Chiang Kai-shek's foreign minister staked the claim that would define the Republic of China to the present day. That Taiwan is part of the territory of China is generally acknowledged by all concerned powers. Referring to the Cairo Conference, the KMT was desperate to cling on to the last Chinese territory it had. For Chiang Kai-shek and much of the Republic of China's leadership, the Civil War was unfinished business, and they actively planned to return to the mainland to liberate it from the Communist Party. If Taiwan was ruled to be separate from China by the United Nations, it would erase the KMT's claim to be the rightful government of China, and admit defeat to the Communist Party. This could be more damaging than it first appears, as the United Nations still recognized the Republic of China as the true China. So, despite only possessing Taiwan, the Republic of China was one of the Big Five, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council alongside France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The KMT's position conclusively tied Taiwan to China as a single nation-state. The US government's 1950 NSC 68 memo tabled a more proactive anti-communist worldview. This was redoubled in policy by the new Eisenhower administration, who envisaged a key role for Taiwan to help contain Soviet forces, to act as an advanced base and a geographic barrier to prevent Soviet air and naval forces ranging deep into the Pacific. With Communist China's intervention in the Korean War, the United States viewed the People's Republic as the primary threat to Asia. Chiang Kai-shek had offered to send 33,000 troops to defend South Korea, which was ultimately turned down. Determined to continue the war against the Communist Party wherever possible, the Republic of China Navy maintained a naval blockade against the mainland with little success. Dogfights over the straits were commonplace. The Nationalist Air Force and the CIA established an air bridge to KMT fighters who had escaped into northern Burma, using transports and privateer patrol aircraft to bring supplies and weapons. The attempted guerrilla war was ultimately unsuccessful, and the KMT in Burma were evacuated to Taiwan in 1953, though many stayed to partake in the lucrative opium trade in the Golden Triangle. Eisenhower withdrew the 7th Fleet from the Taiwan Strait, seeing little logic in protecting Communist China in the Straits and fighting it in Korea. Taiwan attempted an airborne and amphibious landing on the island of Dongshan, but this resulted in catastrophic nationalist casualties. After this raid, and with the end of the Korean War, the US pressured Taiwan not to conduct any cross-strait operations without American approval. So far, the US had avoided signing a defense agreement with Taiwan, as it had with South Korea, primarily due to Taiwan's control of several islands close to the Chinese coast, namely Kinmen, Matsu, Dachen, and Nanri. Fundamentally, the Eisenhower administration was unsure whether it was willing to go to war over these small, strategically vulnerable islands. On the other side of the strait, chairman of the Communist Party, Mao Zedong, was increasingly anxious at the prospect of a solidified US-Taiwanese alliance. In discussions with Joseph Stalin and Kim Il-sung, Mao had championed an invasion of Taiwan, and even tried to delay the start of the Korean War to give himself more time. Taking a US-protected Taiwan would be impossible, and to Mao, the islands presented an opportunity to drive a wedge between his two adversaries. On the 3rd of September, nationalist positions on the island of Kinmen were struck by a deluge of artillery fire. Over 5 hours, Communist artillery fired over 6,000 shells with impressive accuracy. Retaliatory airstrikes from Taiwan destroyed a number of the guns. Among the dead were 2 American military advisors. While US naval forces were dispatched to the region, the Eisenhower administration felt that the islands were indefensible and sought to resolve the crisis through the United Nations. But in rejecting a peace proposal, Communist China took a similar position to the KMT. The Premier of the People's Republic, Zhou Enlai, proclaimed, "If the idea was to discuss the islands, then that constituted intervention in China's internal affairs. All-out war over the islands, without any immediate threat to Greater Taiwan, was an unpopular idea with the White House, compounded by the fact that close allies like Britain recognized the People's Republic and had little appetite for a major war over the cause." In 1955, the Communist People's Liberation Army took the Yijiangshan Islands, putting the Dachen Islands in an even more perilous position. Chiang Kai-shek had refused to withdraw from the islands in the Straits for fear of losing face, but now he accepted that Dachen was indefensible, and reasoned that the resources could be better put to use in defending Matsu and Quemoy. Eisenhower ordered the US Navy's 7th Fleet into the strait to commence Operation King Kong. Under the cover of 5 aircraft carriers, 2 heavy cruisers and 18 destroyers, 30,000 civilians and nationalist troops were evacuated from Dachen to Taiwan. While the evacuation was a complete success, it was a blow to nationalist morale. President Eisenhower recognised this, observing to British Prime Minister Anthony Eden that another single backward step in the region would have the gravest effect on all our Chinese friends. Yet, this tactical victory for Communist China translated into a strategic failure. In the wake of Operation King Kong, the United States and Taiwan negotiated the 1955 Mutual Defense Treaty, promising American military support if the Republic of China was attacked, and securing the permanent deployment of American troops under the US Taiwan Defense Command. Instead of dividing the United States and the Republic of China, Chairman Mao had united his two enemies. Whether the remaining island groups, Kinmen and Matsu, were included under the agreement was still a point of contention within the US government, so they were not mentioned in the text of the treaty. This was a deliberate ambiguity to deter Mao while giving the United States the most political room for manoeuvre. On the 23rd of August 1958, concerned by the presence of large numbers of Taiwanese troops still stationed on Kinmen, the People's Liberation Army launched another massive artillery bombardment. Around 40,000 shells carpeted the island, while the fledgling PLA Navy's patrol boats mounted a blockade. The Republic of China requested American assistance. President Eisenhower had briefly contemplated the use of nuclear weapons, but ultimately the United States adopted a two-step approach to avoid being dragged into a war. First, the blockade had to be broken. Taiwanese Navy landing craft were shepherded to the island, escorted by US Navy destroyers and covered by the 7th Fleet. The American naval presence deterred the Communist naval forces and allowed the islands to be resupplied. Next, to defuse the Communist Party's justification for its constant shelling, the US Secretary of State, Foster Dulles, convinced Chiang Kai-shek to reduce troop numbers on Kinmen. In exchange, the United States would supply key military equipment to the Nationalists. Famously, the Republic of China Air Force achieved a measure of air superiority over the Straits of Taiwan thanks to its F-86 Sabres being fitted with newly supplied AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, which it used to great effect against mainland MiG-15s and MiG-17s. To defend Kinmen and make up for the drawdown of troops, the United States rushed surplus artillery to the Nationalist Army, notably including dozens of massive M1 240mm howitzers. Nicknamed the Black Dragon, these 240mm guns still stand guard today. The US Taiwan Defense Command was rapidly reinforced by American units, among which was a squadron's worth of US Air Force F-104 starfighters, which were dismantled and airlifted to Taiwan, then reassembled and put into action. The Chinese Communist Party ceased its bombardment on the 6th of October 1958. This would be the last major crisis between the rival Chinas, though sporadic skirmishes would continue. Republic of China Air Force surveillance aircraft, including CIA-supplied U-2s, regularly carried out reconnaissance flights deep into the People's Republic of China, often falling victim to surface-to-air missiles and MiGs. Otherwise, the next few decades for both the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China would not be one of conflict, but rather a time of dramatic internal and international change. For Mao Zedong's China, the late 50s and early 60s were a dark period. Mao had outlined to his party a new national objective, to surpass Britain in industrial output and attain true communism. The second of several 5-year plans, known as the Great Leap Forward, was launched in 1958. In rural villages, collectivized farming and industrial production was combined into small self-sufficient communes. Mao hoped that he could dramatically improve agricultural output and at the same time exponentially increase industrial output by up to 2,000%. Such incredible demands resulted in poor quality steel and overworked land, which resulted in poor crop yields. Mao's reign of terror silenced all critics, so grain quotas were raised to match increasingly fanciful production figures. Often, communes were stripped of their entire harvest to meet ever-growing quotas, leaving little for the villagers. The vicious cycle continued until much of rural China was gripped by famine. Farmers starved to death. Some communes even resorted to cannibalism. Most estimates suggest that 30 million people, 5% of the population, died by 1962. It was in this moment of national weakness that Chiang Kai-shek ordered the Republic of China's armed forces to prepare a plan for Operation Kuo Kwang, National Glory, on the 1st of April 1961. Taiwan's army, even in its bloated 1961 state, was far too small and under-equipped to launch a full-scale invasion of mainland China. The United States deemed such an effort suicidal. Chiang's plan depended on massive American material and logistical support to buttress any invasion from Taiwan, which would follow a popular uprising against the Chinese Communist Party, which Chiang seemingly believed he could incite. In a letter to newly elected President Kennedy, he argued that due to the famine, the Chinese people have nothing but the deepest hatred for the brutal communists. In truth, Mao was still wildly popular, and his cult of personality was so powerful that the blame was pointed at virtually everything but the Communist Party. In the end, American support was not forthcoming, and the plan was shelved. The United States was not only unwilling to launch a poorly conceived invasion of mainland China, but the government's perception of China was slowly changing. Mao's China was not as openly aggressive as the United States suspected. In 1961 and 62, the US observed a build-up of forces in southern China, but managed to avoid another crisis by using their respective ambassadors to Poland to communicate face-to-face. The Chinese diplomat explained the forces were deployed for defensive purposes. Evidently, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong sensed the same opportunity for an attack on the mainland. In 1957, delegates from the Chinese Communist Party had secretly negotiated with the KMT, proposing to make Taiwan a special administrative region with a degree of autonomy. The KMT, repulsed by how Tibet, another special administrative region, was treated, rejected the offer. However fruitless, it was at least an attempt at a negotiated solution. Internationally, more nations were recognizing the People's Republic of China over the KMT on Taiwan. As post-colonial nations in Africa, which tended to share pro-PRC sympathies, were accepted into the United Nations, the situation grew steadily worse for Taiwan. President Kennedy, seeking to appear strong on communism, maintained the Eisenhower administration's support for Taiwan, but even Eisenhower had recognized the illogic of the situation and had raised the possibility of resuming trade and economic relations with the mainland as far back as 1954. To appease the growing recognition of Communist China and preserve the Republic of China's international position, the US State Department repeatedly suggested the closest thing to a middle ground, a two Chinas policy. The idea was the Republic of China would maintain its seat at the UN and accept the accession of the PRC as a new member. The Nationalists flatly refused. Republic of China Foreign Minister Wai Tao-ming explained, "Our basic policy is to overthrow the Communists and recover the mainland, and therefore the Republic of China is opposed to any form of two Chinas." Relenting, the Johnson administration continued to use America's sway at the UN to maintain Taiwan's elevated position, though the nature of the alliance was evolving. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the United States directly intervened in the Vietnam War. As it had in the Korean War, the KMT jumped at the opportunity to attack what it viewed as Chinese-backed forces. In September 1965, Chiang Kai-shek dispatched his own son Chiang Ching-kuo to Washington to advocate an invasion of Guangdong province. Lyndon B. Johnson, above all else, sought to avoid a communist Chinese intervention in Vietnam, so naturally was not thrilled by the idea of invading the mainland. By this point, Taiwan had more potential to be a hindrance than a help in America's Cold War strategy. While Taiwan's role in the Vietnam War would be limited to advisors, civil assistance, and clandestine operations, Vietnam would heavily influence Taiwan's future. By 1969, the new Nixon administration saw an opportunity to court the Chinese government to facilitate an end to the Vietnam War. Furthermore, the rivalry between the People's Republic and the Soviet Union had boiled over into a brief border conflict, only ended by the threat of nuclear war between the two powers. With such an opportunity to split the communist world, then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger travelled to Beijing in secret. At the United Nations in mid-1971, Taiwan's position was growing increasingly perilous, though, after months of difficult diplomacy, the US State Department had been able to convince Chiang Kai-shek of a practical two China's policy, which would see Taiwan lose its seat at the Security Council to the PRC, but still remain a member of the General Assembly. Kissinger completely undercut this effort. In their first July 1971 meeting, Kissinger and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai discussed the grounds for normalizing relations between the US and China. Kissinger, despite the US State Department's position, declared that the US did not support an independent Taiwan, nor the two China's policy. Instead, he acquiesced to the mainland's interpretation of the One China argument and agreed to expel the Republic of China from the United Nations General Assembly altogether in favour of the PRC. UN General Assembly Resolution 2758 cemented this promise. With the US government at odds with itself, the State Department's ambassador to the UN, George H.W. Bush, attempted a rearguard action to at least keep Taiwan in the General Assembly, if not the Security Council. The vote passed, and Taiwan was ejected from the United Nations, followed by almost all major international organizations, in favor of the People's Republic of China. The next year, President Richard Nixon visited the People's Republic of China for the first time. The two parties issued a joint statement known now as the Shanghai Communique. Among many general statements about Asia and the future of Sino-American relations, it outlined the respective positions of the Chinese Communist Party and the United States on Taiwan's sovereignty. From the PRC, the government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is a province of China which has long been returned to the motherland. The liberation of Taiwan is China's internal affair in which no other country has the right to interfere, and all US forces and military installations must be withdrawn from Taiwan. The Chinese government firmly opposes any activities which aim at the creation of One China, One Taiwan, One China, Two Governments, Two Chinas, an independent Taiwan, or advocate that the status of Taiwan remains to be determined. And from the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. With this prospect in mind, it affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal of all US forces and military installations from Taiwan. In the meantime, it will progressively reduce its forces and military installations on Taiwan as the tension in the area diminishes. China and the United States cooperated behind the scenes to secure the pausing of the Vietnam War at the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. Finally, in 1979, the United States and China officially established diplomatic relations, which inherently meant the end of official diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Concurrently, it ended the 1955 Mutual Defense Treaty established under President Eisenhower, and saw the withdrawal of all US forces from the island. The Chinese perspective outlines the standard One China policy, which it maintains to date. The US position sounds like it agrees with the One China policy. However, American policy hinges on one word: acknowledges. By simply acknowledging rather than recognizing China's view, US diplomats did not actually commit the United States government to agree with the Chinese Communist Party, and gave the US enough room to maneuver. Immediately after President Carter recognized the People's Republic, Congress passed the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, using creative wording. The act provided for friendly relations between the US and the people of Taiwan, rather than outwardly recognizing the Republic of China government and angering China. The act also required the US government to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. While not a cast-iron guarantee like the 1955 treaty, this clearly did imply that the US would defend Taiwan from attack. In 1982, Congress further distanced the United States from the One China policy, asserting that the United States government takes no position on Taiwan's sovereignty. In a process spanning 3 presidencies, American policymakers had made Taiwan an international outcast, sacrificing it to forge a relationship with Communist China. But they had walked a diplomatic tightrope to maintain unofficial relations with the island and safeguard its sovereignty without offending their new friends in Beijing. On the 5th of April 1975, in the midst of a whirlwind of change, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek died. Death could not temper his life's ambition. His body was not buried for 30 years in his hopes that he would one day be interred in a liberated mainland. His son, Chiang Ching-kuo, had assumed his father's responsibilities in 1969. Official policy still outlined the Republic of China Armed Forces objectives as consolidate the restoration base and create opportunities for retaking the mainland. However, with American recognition of the People's Republic, the doctrine was increasingly fanciful in the eyes of growing numbers of Taiwanese. Despite both of the Chiang's fears of communist subversion, political opposition was actually quite different. Through the 1960s and 70s, Taiwan's investment in industry had borne fruit, bringing rapid economic growth. Its export-oriented industrial sector was growing in complexity and branching into new areas, such as manufacturing of computer chips. Industrial success, paired with the earlier land reforms, gave birth to a rapidly expanding middle class, a middle class that was predominantly native Taiwanese, that is, Hoklo and Hakka. Despite their contribution to Taiwan's economic miracle, they lacked representation in a KMT party still ruled at the top by the old guard of post-1945 mainlanders. The natives cared little about returning to the mainland. Instead, gripped by their island identity, they wanted the chance to carve out Taiwan's own destiny. In line with the state of emergency in place in 1948, the KMT held no national elections, only relatively safe local and municipal elections, contested by different flavours of KMT candidates. As early as 1964, political opposition had attempted to stand solely on the platform of not being KMT, and by the early 70s, student protests were becoming harder and harder to ignore. Adapting to the new political climate, Chiang Ching-kuo shuffled out more of the old guard and opened up more possibilities for native Taiwanese to be elected independently to the National Assembly and also promoted more Taiwanese in the KMT. Nevertheless, martial law was still in place, and Ching-kuo tempered his appeasement by clamping down on protest movements with mass arrests. Events culminated in 1979 when the editors of the popular pro-independence magazine Formosa and 200 other demonstrators were attacked by police during a protest to mark Human Rights Day. Many of the magazine's staff were arrested, and the publication was outlawed. Lin Yi-hee-sung, one of the Formosa writers, suffered the worst. After his wife contacted Amnesty International due to his harsh treatment, Lin's mother and 2 of his 3 daughters were murdered at his home. No suspect was caught, despite his house being under 24-hour police surveillance. The protest and the high-profile trial that followed brought international attention to the plight of the Taiwanese, buoyed in 1984 by another murder, this time of a Taiwanese journalist and long-standing critic of Ching-kuo living in California. In 1986, a new opposition party was formed illegally by a core of independence activists, the Democratic Progressive Party. In his meandering approach to political opposition, Ching-kuo was pragmatic and, against the wishes of the KMT's hardline members, chose not to clamp down on the fledgling opposition party. It was able to gain 12 seats in the lower house of Taiwan's then 3-chambered parliament. With this small step, Taiwan was gradually evolving into a 2-party democracy. By 1987, Chiang Ching-kuo's health was starting to fail him. As his condition declined, he more clearly outlined his plan for his legacy, to leave the Republic of China as a democracy. In the same year, martial law was finally lifted, after nearly 4 decades, ending the White Terror. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his most trusted advisor, and brainchild of most of the liberalizing reforms, Lee Teng-hui. Lee would serve the rest of Ching-kuo's term. He was a native-born Taiwanese who had grown up during the Japanese occupation. He believed that the Taiwanese people had forged their own identity and sought to end the KMT's obsession with the mainland. The National Assembly re-inaugurated Teng-hui after the end of Ching-kuo's term, officially making Lee Teng-hui the new president of the Republic of China in 1990. That year, he met and listened to the leaders of the Wild Lily student protest movement in Taipei, using their popular pressure to effect change within the KMT. On the mainland, just several months earlier, student protesters clamoring for greater political representation were violently crushed by the People's Liberation Army in Tiananmen Square. The divergence of destinies on the two sides of the strait could not be clearer. Li Tenghui slowly walked back the hyper-militaristic objectives of the old Kuomintang. In an operations meeting with the senior staff of the armed forces, Tenghui paid lip service to the old line, stating, "There is absolutely no change in the goal of unifying China." However, he announced that what has changed is strategy and methods we shall use to achieve that goal. It was announced that military means were not a feasible or preferable option to resolve relations with the mainland. In the following months, the armed forces reframed its doctrine, emphasizing almost entirely defensive operations. Tenghui elaborated that, "We must earn the recognition and support of our compatriots in mainland China, what we can achieve in Taiwan, in economic and especially political terms." This was Taiwan's new interpretation of the One China policy, that reunification should occur as a union of a democratic China, for which Taiwan was the prototype, not force of arms. This was the premise of the 1992 consensus agreed between Taiwanese and Chinese diplomats in then British Hong Kong. Both parties agreed there was one China of which Taiwan was a part, albeit both sides had different interpretations of what that China should look like. Essentially, the governments of the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China agreed to disagree, so they could work together without confronting the elephant in the room. Taiwan's ongoing political change raised difficult constitutional questions. If the government still claimed to represent China, should the National Assembly include representatives for the mainland? This was sidestepped by asserting the Assembly only represented what they called Free China. The repeal of the emergency martial law provisions put in place to suppress the Communist rebellion in 1948 raised more questions. Was the government recognizing the end of the Civil War and therefore the predominance of the Communist People's Republic, or even suggesting there were two Chinas? President Li Tenghui saw no need to officially recognize something that was essentially fact. As the 90s continued, Li Tenghui's increasing Taiwanization of the Republic of China angered the mainland, who saw Taiwan's growing separate identity as a betrayal of the One China principle. By 1995, the island was preparing for another democratic milestone, its first presidential election. Li Tenghui was running for his second term against the Democratic Progressive Party candidate Peng Ming-min. The choice, in Beijing's eyes, was between an already pro-independence leader and a pro-independence opposition. The final straw was when the United States Congress granted Li Tenghui a visa so he could speak at Cornell University, which the Communist Party viewed as tantamount to recognizing the Republic of China. General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and President of the People's Republic, Jiang Zemin, warned against the schemes of foreign forces to interfere with China's reunification and to bring about the independence of Taiwan. Zemin refused to rule out the use of force. The Communist Party wished to send a message to the leaders of Taiwan that China would not simply allow the island to continue on the path to independence. On the 21st of July, the People's Liberation Army launched the first of 6 DF-15 short-range ballistic missiles. These test launches all landed in the sea less than 90 miles from Taipei. Massive Chinese air and naval exercises over the straits followed in August, culminating in an underground nuclear test. In November, the PLA Navy conducted amphibious exercises in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan was no longer militarily equal to the mainland. The People's Liberation Army had swelled in size and technological sophistication, while for the past decade, Taiwan had been hamstrung. Under the Reagan administration, US defense companies were prohibited from selling advanced weapons to Taiwan. Repeated attempts by the ROC to procure F-16 Fighting Falcons were blocked in fear of upsetting the mainland, resulting in Taiwan designing and producing a domestic fighter aircraft, the FCK-1, which had only just entered service. This policy had changed since Tiananmen Square, but the damage had been done. The Navy was being strengthened with a batch of modified Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates being assembled in Taiwanese shipyards, but still totally unable to match the PLA Navy's mass. Concerned by events, President Bill Clinton approved the deployment of the USS Independence and USS Nimitz carrier battle groups. In a show of force, Nimitz and her escorts transited the Taiwan Straits on the 19th of December. Through March of 1996, coinciding with the presidential elections, the PLA redoubled its efforts, mobilizing up to 400,000 troops in southern China and conducting its largest ever exercises. American naval forces maintained their presence. Despite the saber-rattling, President Lee Teng-hui was re-elected with 54% of the vote. While Taiwan increasingly viewed itself as separate from mainland China, the PRC was able to overlook the issue. It clearly outlined its opposition to independence, but restrained from any more military posturing. The benefits of a cordial Sino-American relationship far outweighed the cost of pressing the Taiwan issue, and the Clinton administration went to considerable lengths to improve America's ties to China. In 2000, China was welcomed into the World Trade Organization, very much due to the United States. President Teng-hui freely espoused pro-independence sentiments, proclaiming in 1997 that Taiwan is independent, it owns its own sovereignty. But politically, the Republic of China did not swerve towards further separation. In 2000, the Democratic Progressive Party's Chen Shui-bian triumphed over the KMT in the presidential elections, marking the first successful democratic transition of power. Despite the party's origin, the new president announced that as long as there was no use of force by China, there would be no declaration of independence by Taiwan. This declaration cemented the present stalemate. Shui-bian attempted to normalize relations with the mainland. This was initially met with hostile rhetoric, but the general cooling of tensions permitted improved relations. Taiwanese companies had invested in the mainland since the 1990s. This continued through the 2000s as the island's economy diversified into the computer chips, semiconductors, and other electronics for which it is now famous, opening factories on the mainland and investing in the People's Republic. In 2001, both sides of the strait agreed to create direct communications between Taiwan's outlying islands, Matsu and Kinmen, and the Chinese mainland for trade, mail, and travel. The so-called Three Leagues were expanded to the rest of Taiwan in 2008. Economic ties can be a double-edged sword. While profitable, it meant Taiwan had more to lose, and the mainland had more leverage over the island. In 2014, President Ma Ying-jeou of the now ruling KMT was championing the Cross-Strait Service Trade Agreement, which would allow greater Chinese investment in Taiwan and the migration of workers from the mainland. This was massively unpopular with younger voters, who feared that the bill would irrevocably grant China the ability to force political change on the island. The so-called sunflower protests that followed culminated in the occupation of the National Assembly by demonstrators. Protest leader Lin Fei-fan, speaking to The Guardian in 2024, summarized the stakes. Ukraine and Taiwan were facing the same question: join the world or become in orbit of an authoritarian state. For 23 days of sit-ins, protests, and police crackdowns, Ma Ying-jeou conceded to the protesters' demands. Despite the concrete belief in a distinct Taiwanese identity and the fear of an overbearing PRC subsuming the island, the Taiwanese public were not especially anxious about the military threat from the mainland. In a 2015 poll, 81% of respondents supported an increase in defense spending, which sat at 2% of GDP at the time, but 66% of respondents opposed raising taxes to pay for the increase, suggesting that most voters prioritized everyday political issues. There is ongoing debate over whether China's foreign policy underwent a fundamental shift following Xi Jinping's rise to power in 2013, or if its growing assertiveness reflects the natural evolution of the Communist Party's long-standing approach to the world. Regardless, the late 2010s fundamentally altered the security situation in the Pacific, as an increasingly prosperous PRC asserted its claims over disputed territories throughout the South China Sea. Beijing's diplomatic and military pressure was redoubled towards Taiwan in 2020, using the People's Liberation Army Air Force to coerce and intimidate the Republic of China by dramatically increasing flights of combat and surveillance aircraft around the island. As well as an act of intimidation, this had a tangible effect on the Republic of China Air Force, forcing them to put hours and wear on precious fighter aircraft by constantly scrambling to meet hundreds of Chinese flights, and at a cost of 8.7% of Taiwan's defense budget. In July 2021, Xi Jinping gave a speech commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, which made reference to most of the common motives of CCP political thought. Leading his address, though, was the century of humiliation, contrasting it with the current dream of national rejuvenation. It is worth noting that the only remaining territorial loss from the century of humiliation is Taiwan. Speaking in similar terms, he describes reclaiming Taiwan as a historic mission. While he claims to prefer peaceful unification, he warns that no one should underestimate the resolve, the will, and the ability of the Chinese people to defend their national sovereignty and territorial integrity. While sounding relatively innocuous, the warning resonates differently when paired with Zhou Enlai's warning that US involvement with Taiwan constituted intervention in China's internal affairs. 60 years may separate the two figures, but they sew policy from the same ideological thread. This principle also explains the PRC's response to US Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's high-profile visit to Taiwan in 2022. After repeated PRC threats and warnings against the trip, Pelosi's arrival was met with a surge in PLA air and naval activity around Taiwan, and, in a move mirroring the 1995 crisis, ballistic missiles were fired over the island, landing in the South China Sea. Taiwan reported a staggering increase in cyber attacks, 23 times higher than the previous record. Despite the rising tensions, and the pervasive feeling in some parts of the United States and the Greater West that confrontation with China is increasingly inevitable, the majority of Taiwanese people are concerned but do not fear imminent war. The Brookings Institute noted a moderate increase among ROC citizens in concern that the mainland would use military force against Taiwan, but life goes on. In the 2024 elections, cross-strait relations were far less important to voters than economic issues like minimum wages and housing prices. For the CCP, Taiwan's increasingly separate identity is a cause of anxiety, and an official declaration of independence is a red line that the Communist Party has repeatedly outlined. Yet, declaring independence is not a popular position in Taiwan. Both the conservative KMT and the independence-minded DPP are committed to maintaining Taiwan's status quo, which is being functionally de facto independent, albeit not declaring it openly and forcing the issue with the mainland. While visions for the future vary, 88% of voters support maintaining the status quo for at least the time being. Nevertheless, reunification is still a strategic priority for the Communist Party of China, and as the PLA Navy expands into a credible Blue Ocean Navy with a rapidly maturing expeditionary capability, an invasion of Taiwan is increasingly possible in a practical sense. Taiwan's incumbent president Lai Ching-te has pledged a $20 billion increase in the nation's defense budget. Ultimately, such an increase is a drop in the ocean compared to the mainland's burgeoning military and economic might, especially in the context of an increasingly isolationist United States with an unpredictable president. How the situation in the Taiwan Straits will unfold over the next decade is impossible to predict, but despite the fears of conflict before 2030, there are still avenues of peace open to both parties.